It has been a couple years now since Victoria 3 came out, and so much has changed. I'm not just talking about within Victoria 3 itself, but monumental events like the release of EU5 have forever reshaped the world in which games like Victoria 3 live. What was once maligned as a bare-bones game with little redeeming qualities has, in the words of the developers, hit its stride at long last. Those that know me know that I tend to be pretty critical of a lot of stuff in general, whether it be game design or DLCs or even my own work, but I always come at my critiques with the belief that what I'm saying is hopefully constructive. I actually made a comprehensive critique of Victoria 3 way back when it first came out, and you know what's funny? I think that video is really bad. I think it failed to really capture what the main complaints were with Victoria 3. It instead was very high-minded, talking about economic theory and concepts, blah blah. I did a better job in my 1,000-hour review, which was much more focused on the actual way that the game's systems create gameplay loops, but the thing is, so much has changed since both of those videos came out. There's a common denominator to both of them though, and that's that I kept on talking about how I didn't like the game, about how I felt its positives were failing to overcome the flaws, and that I still had more hate in the love-hate relationship I carry with Victoria 3. I think that as of 2026, Happy New Year by the way, I no longer have an imbalance of hate, and instead have come to love Victoria 3 because it has indeed hit its stride. It's a game now which manages to reach pretty close to what I believe to be the ideal grand strategy game, in that Hegelian sense of the idea of a perfect entity that embodies all aspects of its type. To put it in similar terms, I think Victoria 3 is the best Paradox grand strategy game currently, because it provides the most fun across the most aspects of grand strategy gaming's core features. With that thesis, I need to outline a few things. First, what are these core features of grand strategy gaming? And second, some caveats, since I just made a pretty big claim there. Before we get into everything, I just want to say that this is a long video, and I'm letting myself yap for this one because it's a real passion project. That being said, I am doing my best to keep things concise, as the best communication is that done in as few words as possible. Feel free to use the chapters to jump around to what parts of my analysis you might be interested in, but keep in mind that this is intended to be consumed holistically, and if you skip around too much, you might miss important context from chapter to chapter. With that, let's begin by defining these core GSG features. When I talk about aspects of grand strategy gaming, what I mean is all the different draws that a game like this will have for its player base. Ask yourself this: why do you play any grand strategy game? Do you play CK3 because you enjoy roleplay? Do you play EU4 because you like stacking modifiers and planning out builds? Do you play Hoi4 because you like multiplayer? Well, I've boiled down the draws of grand strategy gaming to these categories. Decision making, which is to say, strategy in the macro scale. This refers to picking idea groups in EU4, or deciding how to educate your kids in CK3, among many other things in other GSGs. In Victoria 3, it might refer to your build order, your tech, your company choices, and again, a lot of things. This is the biggest part of grand strategy games probably, it's in the name. Then there's roleplay, which is to say enacting some kind of story in your game. This is not referring to doing a funny voice as you play your weirdo inbred character in CK3, but instead to say that you have some kind of narrative cohesion to the campaign. Challenging tactical gameplay, which is best simplified as having opposition against whom you may use a variety of tactics to defeat. A game like Hearts of Iron 4, at least for a guy like me, presents a tactical challenge, as I might need to actually figure out how to micro units to succeed in situations in that game. You might also call this strategy in the micro scale. Next is simulation, which is a broad category of how well the game feels like it's tied to some kind of reality. That doesn't necessarily have to refer to historical accuracy, but rather that when you look at the numbers in the game, they mean something that makes sense for what they represent. Oftentimes people like it when the simulations feel somewhat rooted in history, but we'll expand on that more in the proper chapter. Line go up is a concept that people like stacking numbers. Modifiers, GDP, factories, and so on. Laugh all you want, but would EU4 be as fun as it is if you couldn't stack 150% discipline or something ridiculous like that? Some might actually say that that detracts from the game, but again, we'll get to that in the appropriate chapter. Multiplayer is quite self-explanatory. For some people, a grand strategy game lives or dies on its ability to make multiplayer interesting. Lots of people only play Hearts of Iron 4 for multiplayer, while others don't play any at all. Alternate history is the ability to create new worlds and ties closely into roleplay, but I count it separately because roleplay mostly comes from the player, but alternate history has to come from the game. Compare, for example, the roleplay in EU4 maybe of like naming your heir after some important historical figure versus a historical figure actually having an impact on the story of the game, which does or doesn't follow their historical role. One you make up, the other the game gives you. And finally, we have identity, which is often just called flavor. Flavour is the uniqueness of a playthrough, which can be a broad set of things, but includes a focus tree if it's HOI4, or decisions for CK3, or a mission tree in EU4, or maybe unique events and advancements in EU5, and so on. Okay, wow, that was a lot of information. These, to me, are the core features of a GSG, and if you think there's something I've missed, I'd actually be very curious to know what you think, so put it in the comments. That aside, I believe that among the current set of Paradox Grand Strategy games, Victoria 3 manages to provide the best experience in aggregate across these categories, in the sense that CK3 probably does roleplay better, but it flops hard on many other aspects, and that HOI4 definitely has a better sense of challenging tactical gameplay, but again it flops in other places. Victoria 3 has its strengths and weaknesses like any game, but if we were to grade it on a scale of 1 to 10 on each core feature and then add up the scores, it'd be higher than any other Paradox GSG. You see what I mean, right? The rest of this video is going to be me proving that assertion, and it actually starts with talking about some caveats. We really need to talk about what Victoria 3 does indeed fail to do before we talk about where it shines, and there are two main reasons for that. First, there's a lot of misinformation about what's wrong with Victoria 3 out there, and that needs to be corrected. I'm a fan of Victoria 3, but I know it has flaws, and yet many complaints about the game are simply no longer accurate as the game has evolved. I don't think there's any malice intended per se by some of this misinformation, simply a failure to follow a game's development, which is understandable given that someone that spreads their hate for Victoria 3 probably is neither playing it nor following how it's changing. The second reason to talk about caveats is because in highlighting the nature of Victoria 3's failings, we can actually better see its successes. So, the caveats. I've got a list here that I've assembled from a combination of my own analysis and from just asking my Discord for their critiques. I did also watch some videos which critique Victoria 3 in the hopes of finding things to bring up, and in some of those videos there were salient points and in others just outdated critiques or, at times, blatantly incorrect statements. Let's get into it. Among the myriad critiques of Victoria 3, none are more salient, more aggressive, nor more stubborn than the accusation, or one might even say the, at this point, aphorism, that warfare is bad. I call it an aphorism at this point because it is indeed a pithy statement with little to it anymore. Remember, this isn't 2022, folks. Yes, warfare was bugged out of its mind, broken, and indeed the entire game was barely functioning when it first came out. But things have changed, they well and truly have. Now before I turn the statement "things have changed" into an aphorism of its own, let me expand on that. Victoria 3's warfare has, since its inception, been focused on the macro instead of the micro, as evidenced by the absence of individual regiments that you can move across the map. Now I'm gonna say this, if you enjoy microing units, then yes, that's missing from Victoria 3, but I want to follow that up with a question. If that particular form of gameplay is pivotal to you and your enjoyment of grand strategy games, why are you playing any Paradox suite of grand strategy games? You know what game has really good micro of units? StarCraft. Okay, sorry, that's obviously disingenuous because that's a totally different genre, but do you see what I'm going here? It's my opinion that none of the Paradox grand strategy games find their greatest strength in the microing of units, with the explicit exception, maybe, of something like HOI4, but it's hard for me to comment on that because I don't play much HOI4. Let's set Hearts of Iron aside for a second and talk about literally every other GSG. Are you playing for the micro? Is it that important a thing for you? No, I really don't think it is. If you play EU4, I think you're there to stack modifiers or to pursue mission trees. I think you're there to do crazy tag switches, or you're there to conquer the world or something. I think if you're playing CK3, you're definitely not there for the micro on the units. I'm not saying it's that micro has zero importance. I'm saying that I bet you can name at least one thing you dislike about whatever your favorite GSG is, and yet that flaw doesn't preclude you from enjoying the game, and that's because that flaw isn't pivotal to your enjoyment. What do you enjoy about microing your units? I'm going to take the leap and say that you like it because it gives you a sense of challenging tactical gameplay, one of our core features you might remember. Choosing how to stack your units, what terrain to fight on, exploring the fog of war, and choosing commanders who might be well suited to different terrains, and so on, these are tactical choices that you make on the fly. So look, I'll tell you now, Victoria 3 is lacking in that particular aspect. You don't position units, you don't deal with the fog of war, your commanders have a relatively minimal impact on combat, barring some exceptions like the tactful trait or the trench rat trait. However, where I take umbrage with the judgment of Victoria 3's warfare is the belief that it is simply bad because it lacks mechanics or isn't interesting or that it's just random. This is not the case and shows that either you looked at the game on release, judged it, and then plugged your ears and just kept repeating the critique, or you are just unfamiliar with the levers at your disposal to affect wars, in which case, what are you talking about? The disconnect here is caused by the fact that warfare and other GSGs falls into that tactical micro game, but in Victoria 3 it instead falls into the macro game of strategy. War requires goods, and if you have the right goods, you can afford more mobilization options. You might even make a company that creates prestige weapons, which give you a boost to your ability to survive. You might cozy up to a great power who can protect you, or you might willingly accept being subjugated by the enemy pursuing you, hoping to one day regain your independence. These are all strategies that involve your macro decision making. On account of that, Victoria 3 does have interesting warfare, it just doesn't have interesting micro. That all being said, Victoria 3 does still have challenge, which is the primary characteristic by which I would rank something like a challenging tactical gameplay metric. It's just that it's more strategic than tactical if you want to mince words. That all being said, whatever, this is a caveat section, so let me give the Victoria 3 haters some catharsis real quick. Oh my god, diplomatic plays suck so much. Diplomatic plays are held back by a completely schizophrenic AI that will betray you over nothing and add war goals like investment rights in Tahiti or something. Diplomatic plays are horrifically rigid in that I can neither abandon war goals that I lose confidence in, nor can I add new ones once I gain confidence. The AI will very rarely ever back down unless you absolutely spam huge war goals on them while having 50 times their army size. Infamy's balance is totally out of whack, with random colonial states in Africa costing only marginally less infamy than great cities like London. When infamy is calculated based only on incorporation status and population, it creates a world where London is as valuable as Brittany, when in reality, the conquest of a city like London ought to be significantly more diplomatically stressing than the conquest of Brittany or Provence or even like Ulster or whatever. Anyway, the total caveat here in this point is that yes, Victoria 3 fails to provide much of a tactical game, and that its warfare system does have flaws, but that the flaws are not what people say they are. It's not that warfare is boring or random or uninteresting, it's that you don't micro it, you macro it. That's not the only caveat for Victoria 3, of course. One thing I touched on was that Victoria 3's armies are critiqued for being random, and this is interesting because what is often attributed to randomness can often instead be attributed to poor communication. The most classic example is the randomness of where battles happen. Well, guess what? Generals actually have locations and actually do always fight in the same spot. It's just that you'd have no way of knowing that, and if you have multiple generals in an army, you'll just kind of see battles happening in seemingly random spots. That system isn't actually random, it's just never explained outside of this extremely rare tooltip. Tooltips in Victoria 3 are troubled, and I often point to the wage tooltip to best explain this. This wage tooltip you see right now is two things: useless and factually incorrect. Notice these two screenshots. If wages are based on the average wage in the state of Bihar, why are they different from each other? In case you think this number is derived from the types of jobs being worked here, then keep in mind that base wages are the number before job modifiers. Now the funny thing is, I do have something of an understanding of how wages are calculated. They tend to increase as productivity increases, and they tend to increase as standard of living increases in a state, but it's all a black box of information. This is stuff I figured out through playing thousands of hours, not because anyone told me. Even then, my own heuristic is sometimes wrong. I might seek to use the wage tooltip to help me understand how the system works, but this tooltip is useless to me, and Victoria 3 tends to have quite a few useless tooltips. For example, this political strength tooltip shows me that most of why the intelligentsia are powerful is because they get their strength from votes, then from wealth, and then what the hell is this average wealth 17.3 colon 25.20 per political active pop? Oh, and then it shows these percentage modifiers, but there's no total at the bottom. Oh, I see. It's showing its work for how it got the 36.8 million political strength from wealth. Nonetheless, if the political strength is 771 million, which is just a number, I don't know what that really means, which is a failure of the game in the simulation aspect I should add. Is that the number after percentage modifiers? Is it before? These tooltips are really bad, and that's another outright flaw of Victoria 3. This game could be improved by better tooltips just objectively. I think transparency of information is an intended aspect of Victoria 3 and most grand strategy games in general, but in this game the transparency is hidden behind nonsense modifiers and hard to follow tooltips. Anyway, those two are the major caveats, war and tooltips, but there are more minor ones like the game's historicity. This is something which I'm under-equipped to personally talk about, so I'm instead going to direct you to Rosenkreuz's videos about the topic, which he has covered in several videos now. He's an excellent essay writer, and I think makes a lot of good points that fly over my game-oriented brain. There'll be links to his Victoria 3 videos in the description, and if you're interested in how Victoria 3 mucks up its historical accuracy, you can watch those videos. There are also bugs in Victoria 3, but honestly, nothing as major as there once was. Most of the time they're just kind of funny, like this Pakistani separatist movement which has Hindu faith in my game Here is India. In this case, this bug got through, I think, because basically no one plays India long enough to reach these sorts of endgame journal entries, so whoever designed the Pakistani separatist movement forgot to check the faith on them. Ultimately, this is a funny edge case more than anything, and most Victoria 3 bugs tend to be this way. The game's balance in general is kind of off, with places like India having what feels like zero resources. I mean, goddamn bro, only 9 sulfur mines in all of India. Even if that's meant to be some kind of historically accurate distribution of resources, which I doubt, it just feels awful gameplay-wise. Meanwhile, Norrland has about as much forestry available as British Columbia. The entire nation of Sweden, not just Norrland, is a grand total of 450,000 square kilometers, while British Columbia has 944,000 square kilometers of area, and you're telling me that this well over doubling of area results in just 10 more logging camps. Yeah, right. These sorts of balance issues more or less plague any grand strategy game in the sense that, like, I challenge you to present me any strategy game in general which actually has, like, perfect balance. However, I can, without excuse, say that Victoria 3 is unbalanced in a lot of ways. The last caveat I'll address is that Victoria 3 doesn't really give a fair shake to authoritarianism, and what I mean is that authoritarian nations like Prussia, Russia, Austria, and others simply have nothing to use their authoritarianism for, with the explicit exception of Austria, who does have authoritarian-oriented journal entries. The authority number itself is a useful tool, I suppose, but we have no ability to, like, deport pops or force new laws in or to truly rule by decree. Sure, the Caudillos of South America have a rule by decree button, but all it does is cheapen the authority cost of decrees. It doesn't let me just outright ban membership to some political party or something. That being said, maybe you can abstract authoritarian power as the authority number and the suppressed button for political movements. Like, yeah, okay, sure, but that doesn't feel direct enough. Victoria 3 pretty much always pushes you towards liberalization, and maybe that's a comment on the progress of the world's politics throughout history, but in terms of gameplay, it feels like pigeonholing. Now, if any of these flaws are enough to turn the game into a non-starter for you, then okay, that's your choice. These are, in my opinion, the irredeemable flaws of Victoria 3, and a lot of them could be fixed by just, like, patching it. Bugs can be patched, resource distribution can be rebalanced, diplomatic plays can be redesigned, but I'm not going to fall for the trap of saying, oh yeah, this is bad, but it'll get fixed. I'm judging the game based on what it currently is as of January 1st, 2026 on patch 1.12.3, which is when I started writing the script in earnest. If those flaws aren't enough to turn the game into a non-starter for you, then stick around and let me explain to you what Victoria 3 does so well as to make it the best Paradox Grand Strategy game as we start with its macro game, decision making. As we get into each of these core features, I want to make a compare and contrast for Victoria 3. It's only natural that these games will be evaluated in comparison to each other, so I feel it's necessary to embrace that. That being said, there's no guarantee that you will know the mechanical ins and outs of these other games, or even Victoria 3 for that matter, so for that reason, I will give very cursory explanations of mechanics as they come up if it feels necessary, but only briefly. That means that if I undersell a mechanic or avoid spending a ton of words describing it in a completely different game, you'll have to forgive me. I think Victoria 3's decision making is best compared to EU4. Before we dive into that comparison, let's talk about what makes strategic decision making fun in a strategy game. It's a harder question to answer than you might think. A good strategic decision is one where the outcome of the choice has meaningful consequences for either the success or failure of your goals in the game. A choice with no consequences is no choice at all. Thus, we're looking to judge Victoria 3's strategic choices by the consequences they have on the game, which is a very broad metric. As we outlined earlier, strategic decision making in a GSG more or less corresponds to macro choices like your build. In EU4, your idea groups, which are permanent modifiers you spend a limited resource on acquiring, are the most salient form of strategic decision making, but it can include more than that, like what nations you ally with, what regions you conquer, and perhaps what privileges you give to your estates. EU5 features similar decision-making systems, except there are no idea groups, and instead you pick what advancements to research, which is limited by the fact that there are more advancements than there is time to get them all. Victoria 3 has a very similar system to both of these games in the form of companies and tech. A company is sort of like an idea if you stretch the idea. See what I did there? A bit. Companies give a semi-permanent bonus to your nation, in that you can lose it and regain it based on your prosperity, and they also guide how you will specialize your economy. Tech in Victoria 3 is similarly limited by time in that you either spend a ton of money on universities to get all the techs, which is one decision, or you keep your research slow but pick and choose what techs you want. Victoria 3's companies are simultaneously your nation's economic identity in that they signal what you specialize in, and they are how you assemble your build. Are you playing a nation which intends to go to war a lot? Well, you'll want a company whose prosperity bonuses provide offensive and defensive buffs, but it's actually more complicated than that. The basic armaments company available to any nation gives a 5% bonus to offense and defense, and also provides a prestige small arm good, which further increases the stats on your army. The problem with this company is that it's not going to contribute much to your economy on account of it covering buildings which don't tend to generate much GDP. Some buildings, like steel mills, motors, iron mines, coal mines, and so on, are much better at generating GDP, jobs, and investment pool contributions, and so on. Well, France has access to the Schneider et Compagnie company, which controls steel mills, motors, and artillery. It gives some morale bonuses, and access to prestige artillery, which will also increase your stats like the prestige guns. This company is much more valuable for the economy than the basic armaments company, but notice it doesn't cover the small arms industry, making it a bit less useful for strengthening your army. There are 205 companies available in the game with all DLCs, most of which have different prosperity effects and different industries they cover, but not all of them are available to every country, of course, so that's a bit overblown. Technically, most companies are accessible through conquest. For example, I had a recent video where I played as Canada and obtained several Brazilian companies by conquering Brazil. Some companies on account of that are more accessible than others. If you want Schneider et Compagnie for your playthrough as like Greece, you're gonna have to work hard to get strong enough to conquer France, and by the time you do, well, you won't really need the military buffs anymore, will you? All this is to say that yes, there are 205 companies, but in reality, you probably have reasonable access to, on any given nation, like, I don't know, between 10 and 75, I'm gonna say, depending on how powerful you are. If you're playing as like Lubeck, you're not gonna be able to get an American company for the first like 50 years of the game. There's still quite a lot of choice, and it's not even just about the prosperity bonus. The choice of what industries to pursue will be heavily dependent on what resources are available in your nation. If you're playing as Sweden, and you don't intend to colonize or conquer anything in Asia, I can't recommend making a silk company for obvious reasons. But let's say you do intend to become the silk master of the world in Sweden, well, here's another choice for you. Will you conquer states from China, which will be tough, but reward you with huge population and a lot of arable land? Or will you go after places in Southeast Asia, which might be easier to conquer, but which might be snapped up by other great powers more quickly? Will you simply sell the silk on the world market, or will you turn it into clothes via textile mills back home? Hell, will you make the textiles in your overseas territories where wages are lower so you can get more profits on it, or will you bring them home where wages are higher and they can give more standard of living? Which silk company will you use? There are a couple available. Even more so, will you double down your textile supply chain? Will you make a textile company, of which there are even more to choose from? These are meaningful decisions that determine your build, and which make pre-game brainstorming and planning very enjoyable. Sometimes you just follow the relatively sane choices, like playing America and founding Carnegie Steel, Ford Motors, and Standard Oil, because those are easily accessible and go together reasonably well. Nothing wrong with that. We could also go over something crazy like my aforementioned Canadian-Brazilian company combo. The nice thing about this is that big nations, which are by far the most commonly played, have reasonable routes to follow, and you're not demanded to do crazy stuff to make fun combos, but if you want to, you can. Meanwhile, because the system is so flexible, minor nations that might not have any flavorful companies to use, they can, through conquest, also engage in complicated builds. It's not like how in EU4 some nations just have bad ideas and no mission tree. If I don't like Norway's companies, I can go conquer some place and get better companies for my purposes. The very planning of these strategies alone is fun, but the process of acquiring them is also a source of strategy and fun itself. If I'm dead set on getting France's Schneider company for whatever reason, well, I'll need to plan around that. That's exactly what I did in the Canada game when I conquered Brazil to get access to their companies. The strategy there was to make an armament company to give my military the edge to defeat Brazil, and yet companies continue to add more strategy because you don't just get the bonus the moment you make the company, you need to make the company prosperous. So that means you also need to orient your economy around that company to some extent. So, with all this in mind, your companies, your economy, your tech, your infamy usage, all of this contributes to your macro decision making, and we haven't even talked about stuff like domestic politics or diplomatic treaties or the budget. This is just the economy, which to be fair is the jewel in the crown of Victoria 3. Looking back at our method of judgment here, we have to ask and answer the following question. What impact does the choice of company selection have on a game of Victoria 3? Well, it determines which land you'll be conquering, what your nation will specialize in, not just economically, but depending on your company choices or perhaps even your focus on things like authority or wages. Your choice of company will determine whether you gain a ton of GDP, or accrue military bonuses, or perhaps influence your politics, as some companies have aristocratic ownership, capitalist ownership, bureaucratic ownership, or just directly impact intergroup clout through their prosperity bonus. That is a massive impact if you ask me, and thus makes the strategy worth engaging with. I love how much variety Victoria 3 provides me in terms of strategy thanks to these companies and their acquisition. It's not as simple as just picking an idea group in EU4, which are simply chosen and then that's it. I know I've harped on this whole Canada-Brazil thing a lot, but I really need to emphasize how much strategizing I need to do to make the Canada-Brazil campaign work out. The prestige guns, the usage of Britain to fight off France who constantly defended Brazil, and the slow dismantling of Brazil until they ceased existing, all while managing my infamy to avoid making the wars even harder. These were all satisfying strategic decisions, which I should emphasize were not meta. No, the meta for Canada would be to simply build all the lumber, make a basic company, and mooch off of Britain's market. It's important to note that my pursuit of Brazil's company cost me a lot of infamy, a lot of money, and a lot of time, which could have been better spent on other targets, making the choice meaningful. It's not like conquering Brazil was just some whatever throwaway choice. Beyond this economic stuff, Victoria 3 has strategy around diplomacy too, albeit it's a much weaker system than the economic strategy since it relies on the AI. A better comparison is instead the infamy system. Infamy is certainly flawed, but what land you choose to conquer, whether for access to pops, resources, or companies, is a huge part of your strategy. This is comparable to how you accrue aggressive expansion in EU4, with part of your strategy perhaps including conquering land in North Africa as Castile to avoid getting a coalition of Catholics against you. Where you conquer is important, and in fact, almost more important than how much or what you conquer. With that, I think I've done a pretty good job of comparing the strategic decision making in Victoria 3 to EU4, but I want to engage in some contrast now. CK3 is a good game, but it's not particularly strategically deep. In CK3, the choice about, for example, what character to appoint to a county does have consequences, but not particularly strategic consequences. If I appoint a certain house or culture or faith, you name it, to a county as my vassal in CK3, then roleplay-wise I might derive some kind of fun for that, but in terms of my decision making, it might only very slightly matter. So as to not go on a tangent about CK3 for an hour, I'll just say that your vassals are simultaneously easy to assimilate to your faith and culture if so desired, but also it doesn't really even change much if you choose not to assimilate them, depending on if you have a fundamentalist faith or not. Not to mention, the choice to appoint a different faith character or a particular house or foreign culture has next to no impact on the governance of the county or your legitimacy or really anything. Again, I emphasize that I do like CK3, but the game's strengths lie not in strategy, but in roleplay. When I play CK3, I don't really think of any of my decisions for the purpose of strategy beyond perhaps things like what dynasty legacies I take or what culture traditions to pick. Even then, those things don't have the broad, far-reaching impact that companies of Victoria 3 do, as we just outlined. It's unlikely that the choice to appoint an Anglo-Saxon count or a Norman count will result in a completely new path of gameplay, to say the least. I'd go on, but I think you understand the contrast, especially if you played CK3, you know how lacking in impact little decisions can have. I still want to emphasize that while CK3 fails in that aspect, I really love it for its storytelling, and obviously it does roleplay much better than Victoria 3 does individually thanks to its characters and their connections to each other. Anyway, let's get to the real key of this section. My contention is that Victoria 3 has a stronger sense of strategic decision making than what we might call the median paradox game. I think its decision making is better when compared to CK3, and maybe about as good as EU4, but it's hard to say. I'd be willing to say that two are equal, or that perhaps Victoria 3 is slightly better in this aspect, but the gap, if there is one, is quite small. Victoria 3, I think, suffers from a similar issue to EU5 in some ways, which is the lack of visibility of its content at times. You know how in EU5 nations feel the same, but in reality the historical events that each nation gets actually inform their unique flavor in many cases, but you don't know how to trigger them, so it feels like they're not there? Well, Victoria 3, with a lot of its strategy being derived from having a plan, when paired with the fact that if you sit and play, let's say, the United States, and just sort of chill, you will probably fall behind Britain and maybe even France economically, but you won't, die, means that you might feel like there's no strategy to be had. Victoria 3 is a game where actual annexation, a proper game over screen, is pretty rare except on certain small nation starts, but it's very easy to simply play a bad game. You can reach 1900 as the United States and fail to reach even 100 million GDP, which I would call a total failure of a game, unless you're just learning, of course. If you don't use strategy to be ambitious and achieve things, then you won't achieve anything noteworthy, but you probably will survive. You will make it to 1936 alive in most cases. This contrasts with EU4, where if you fall behind your neighbors, they might attack and defeat you, and of course if you ever lose one war, then you have to restart the game. It's the unwritten rule of paradox games. Once again, I won't belabor the point, I think you understand what I'm saying. I'd be curious to hear if you think Victoria 3 has more strategic depth than EU4 or even EU5 for sure. I can understand how it might feel like a stretch, but But I think Victoria 3's perception as lacking strategic depth is more a symptom of people not understanding where the strategy is. No one plays Paradox games just to survive, they play them to thrive, right? The strategy required to survive as many nations in Victoria 3 is barely existent, but to thrive, you'll want a game plan. With that, let's move on to the next core feature, roleplay. Okay, let's rip the bandage off right away. Crusader Kings is the obvious game to contrast Victoria 3 to in this aspect, and yes, Crusader Kings 3 has better roleplay mechanics, period. Wow, shocker, I know. That being said, I need to make a few statements to show that this seemingly obvious gap is a bit smaller than you might think, thanks to a few minor mechanics Victoria 3 makes use of. Before that though, we must of course quickly explain by what metrics we're measuring quality roleplay in a grand strategy game. This one is a lot more vibes based, which is inherent to the nature of roleplay, but essentially, we're looking for if the game's mechanics result in cohesive stories that you could potentially tell to your friends or something, and critically, that those stories can be influenced by the player's actions. CK3 is a game which is famous for its players making stories out of what the characters get up to, while Victoria 3 is not. That being said, Victoria 3 does have interesting stories that come out of its mechanics, like turning Britain into a republic and creating a very different society for them by putting, I don't know, Charles Dickens in charge. Perhaps you play France and embrace Napoleon III, or you keep Adolphe Thiers as president after the Orleanist monarchs are deposed. Stories don't have to be character-oriented, and the story you might make could be about the society in general. If you play as America and enact colonial extraction instead of frontier colonialism, and then go conquer pieces of Japan, we could imagine some kind of oppressed Japanese underclass producing silks, dyes, and cotton even for their American overlords, until one day the Japanese political movement gains enough power that America implements multiculturalism. Here's the thing, a lot of this is just sort of in the player's mind. Mechanically speaking, Japanese conquest by America won't really see anything like an Americanized Japanese society, nor would the potential movement of Japanese people into America due to this really result in any changes to American society. Maybe you can make a Japanese company or something and use that to create some kind of Japanese influence, but again, it would just be in your mind, since executives or companies will always be one of your nation's primary cultures, unless there's a historical founder of the company that can take the role. I'm rambling. If you played a nation with an underclass before though, you might be aware of that one event where that underclass culture can put a reformer of their culture in charge of an interest group, and via just this one event, you could one day have a Japanese president of America, like how I got a Native American president back in one of my earliest Victoria 3 videos. This leads us to the critical failure in Victoria 3's roleplay potential, which is that its narrative pushes are almost entirely random events. In my recent Italy video, my king got assassinated by national liberals that wanted a republic, and that was a very convenient and effective story beat. But it was just a random event at the end of the day. Random events have an important place in narratives, including in CK3, but I would say that a better quality role-playing experience is one where I have some agency over the story. That being said, that is a preference, I guess, of mine. It could be that by offloading the narrative content entirely to random events, you actually get more out of it because the game can make a better story than you could by your own actions, but that feels like a cop-out and more of a player skill issue than better design. That's my ultimate contention here. Victoria 3's narrative lacks player agency, putting it in a league below CK3's very player-driven storytelling, but it still has narrative. In Victoria 3, there's an excellent story to be told about the assassination of the Italian king Vittorio Emanuele II in that video, even if I didn't do anything to make that assassination happen beyond getting a lucky narrative dice roll. Thus, CK3 contrasts Victoria 3 narratively in the role of player agency. Victoria 3 doesn't have a lack of story, it just prefers to sit you down and make stuff happen to you, instead of giving you the reins and asking you to be a participant in the story. Well, maybe that's a bit too harsh on Victoria 3. Random events in Victoria 3 aren't quite totally random. Ultimately, the chance of a random event happening can be influenced by your choices. If you want your king to get assassinated, then do something to trigger an insurrectionary movement so you can actually roll the event. It's a rare one, so you're unlikely to get it, but maybe we can call this player agency to some extent. If you want a Japanese president of America, then go conquer Japan and pray for the Japanese leadership event, then work to empower whatever interest group that character took over. Spoiler alert, that event very often gives you a leader for an interest group that has like 0 power, so it might be tough, but there is some agency you have there. It just feels like in Victoria 3 that you have to bend the game and play in a way that doesn't feel right to get this stuff done, unlike CK3 where the whole point is to make those narratives. Now that we've contrasted Victoria 3 to Crusader Kings 3 with regards to roleplay, we can definitely make a comparison to something which sits in its league a little more closely. EU5 makes use of random events to create narrative, but much like with Victoria 3, random events are sort of this arcane thing. The classic example for EU5 is how to get Anglicanism for England. It's a real pain to pull off, and it is indeed just a random event. So if you want to pursue a story that involves an Anglican England, then you just kind of need to get lucky and perhaps check the game files to see how to be in a situation that would allow the event to fire. It's the same thing with Victoria 3. Want your king to be assassinated? Better check the game files for what triggers can allow this to happen. In that sense, both games have narratives which are significantly out of the hands of the vast majority of players, but those willing to data mine can maybe just get a little bit of control going. With that, I don't feel as much need to harp on this aspect of Victoria 3. The other narrative aspects that you can really control are things like what parts of the world you conquer, but I kind of already covered that with the American-Japan hypothetical. Victoria 3 ends up being a very different style of narrative than the sort of narrative that I want from a grand strategy game, but at the same time, it's honestly quite serviceable. With companies and prestige goods, we have a form of expression for a story about controlling a market and creating some sort of unique product for your nation. In the aforementioned Italy video, I ended up making a food-oriented build where my companies made gluten-free products, taking advantage of the fact that Sardinia Piedmont uses rice as its grain. It's a small thing, but being able to rename prestige goods really does add a lot to the ability to make stories in this game. Given the fact that Victoria 3's focus is obviously on things other than roleplay, I think it's entirely acceptable that a game like CK3, whose total focus is RP, has superior RP mechanics to Victoria 3. When put up against other GSGs like EU4, EU5, or even HOI4, I think Victoria 3 stands strong and perhaps even above those titles. CK3 may take the W in this aspect, but as we move on to look at Victoria 3's tactically challenging gameplay, CK3 is about to take a huge L. This is going to be one of the more difficult to explain core features of Victoria 3, as I mentioned in the caveat section that Victoria 3 foregoes a lot of its challenging tactical gameplay for a stronger sense of strategic challenge. But Victoria 3 has actually managed to make a pretty competent AI that does force the player to use some good tactics to outpace them. Immediately, we need to draw the dividing line between tactics and strategy. A strategy is the broad macro aspect of playing the game. It's things like what companies to aim for and what statistics to focus on. Will you outpace the AI by building up the standard of living to get a lot of immigrants who will empower your economy? Will you conquer land and run a high infamy nation to outpace the AI? Those are strategies. The actual tactics are more like what specific tools you have to outpace the AI. I use the word outpace because Victoria 3 is a game where actual confrontation with a great power is rare, as long as you don't get in their way, I guess, or if you want to, you can, but rather, you're competing to do better at building an economy than them. One example of a tactic to try and outpace the AI economically is to specialize in the same goods as them, and then use subventions, or just your companies and their higher throughput, to outcompete them on the world market, reducing their profits and increasing yours. Now, that tactic will have mixed success because against a nation like Britain, they have so many industries making them rich that outcompeting just one won't take them down by any means, but it might let you at least prosper. In a video I did as Haiti a while ago, I managed to completely control the coffee market by using subventions and the fact that Haiti has throughput bonuses to plantations to end up selling more coffee than Brazil. Because I got control of the coffee market from Brazil, they ended up pursuing other industries, letting me dominate the coffee game and actually get pretty rich. This is an example of a tactic, this usage of subventions to push out competing nations in the world market. Victoria 3 is a game which I at first thought would more or less flounder in this aspect, but I have now come to see as a heavier hitter than expected. Before expanding on that, let me explain what makes for success when it comes to challenging tactical gameplay. The main thing is that you have a skilled enough AI to make the need for tactical prowess feel rewarding, while also having a wide enough variety of tactics that different things can be viable. What that can be refined down to is an AI which demands a response but which doesn't demand just one response only in all cases. It would be boring if in every game of Victoria 3 you did the same thing over and over, and some people do in fact do that, which spoils their own fun. If you want to hit like 8 billion pounds of GDP or something, then yes, you're going to find yourself grabbing a coal, iron, and steel company, and a car company, and a tool company, and you'll probably do a lot of conquest, and you might find yourself using the same tactics over and over. But to be clear, the AI will never hit anything close to even like 700 million pounds of GDP, let alone a billion. So reaching for 8 billion is far beyond what you need to defeat the AI. That isn't a flaw, instead that means you have the flexibility to do other tactics like my coffee technique on Haiti, or the food game is Italy that I mentioned last chapter. At the same time, Victoria 3's AI is good enough that you can't just do literally anything and get away with it, which brings us to the contrast of this chapter, Crusader Kings 3. In CK3 you can pretty much do whatever you want, and still survive at least, and perhaps even thrive to be honest. This is not necessarily even a demerit against CK3 broadly, but rather it's only a critique in this particular aspect. If you're looking for a tactical challenge, CK3 is not the game for you, and I think everyone knows that. Victoria 3's AI demands that you make some smart decisions if you want to outpace it, and that feels validating to do because the great powers aren't pushovers. It will demand of you a lot of work and a lot of optimizing if you want to reach the heights of GDP, and that also feels satisfying because big numbers feel good. At the same time, if you just want to survive, you can get away with some pretty suboptimal tactics and still have fun that way, as long as you're willing to accept that the AI will beat you in other aspects. Rather than using a traditional difficulty system, Victoria 3's difficulty selection is just how high you set the bar for yourself. That same sort of logic applies to pretty much all the Paradox games, so that's not unique by any means, but Victoria 3 does a good job of setting the bar at a position where you do need to try to achieve what feels like relatively middling objectives, while providing the creativity of problem solving that makes it worthwhile to perhaps pursue smaller goals in more creative ways. Where I think Victoria 3 is similar to another Paradox game in this aspect is in how Hearts of Iron 4, depending on what nation you play, can have this creative space. I don't play much Hoi 4, as already mentioned, but I've seen those Aldra Hill videos where he does artillery only and other ridiculous challenges. Obviously, if you want to conquer the whole world in Hoi 4, you need to play kind of well. But if you want to just mess around with some funny ideas, then yeah, go ahead and play Germany and do something funny. That idea is shared between Victoria 3 and Hoi 4, although I'd say Hoi 4 probably has a wider variety of tactics. Hard to say because I don't play much of it, but it is kind of true that in Victoria 3, your tactics to achieve your goals are more or less like, do we use voting? Do we not use voting? Are we communist? Do we use high taxes or low taxes? Do we join a powers market and become attached at the hip to them, or pursue an independent economy? Different situations will call for different tactics, but the choice to pursue particular ones will be motivated either by novelty and player choice, or by what's most effective, just depends on the player. That all being said, there is of course a problem with the fact that one of the main friction points of the game, warfare, ends up having almost no tactical choices. Yes, warfare is flawed, and when it comes to putting your army on a front and just watching them fight, we are missing the tactical qualities something like Hoi 4 or even EU4 excel at. Nonetheless, I hold the belief that Victoria 3's warfare is significantly improved when looked at through the lens of the macro warfare system, as we talked about in the caveat section. Rather than your tactic being to take a hill and hold it, or to put a fort on a mountain a la EU4, your tactic instead is to dedicate a company slot to a militarily suited one, which gives bonuses to your military, and to produce the goods that your units need for their mobilization options. Nonetheless, the grand total number of tactics available to you for fighting wars is basically have more modifiers in your stats via either companies or mobilization, have better tech, have more men, or have more allies. There is some tactical prowess to choosing your war goals, as you can't remove or add them once war breaks out, so there does exist, for example, the tactic of finding some isolated state you can easily occupy that just so happens to be incorporated, like Britain's random Indian Ocean islands, and thus can easily be occupied to get a humiliation or money transfer. The thing about stuff like this is that it feels exploity. It doesn't feel like you did something well or outsmarted the AI, it instead feels like the game isn't working right, but whatever, that has its own appeal or disappeal to some people. Given this particular aspect of the game is its weakest, and that it still has a handful of tactics to use and a plethora of strategies to make use of, it ends up being stronger than you'd think. Let me ask you, what are your tactical choices in EU4's wars? Well, you can have more men, have better modifiers via your ideas, you can take advantageous positions in mountains and stuff, you can have a tech advantage, you can divide and conquer your enemies, or you can have a high attrition build and let your enemy run their manpower out on your forts, you can trap enemies on islands, or engage in a siege race, gambling that you'll get their capital before they get yours, you can murk up and ruin your economy, sort of like conscripting in Victoria 3, I guess. But the point is that yes, EU4 does have more tactics. We can admit that and still find ourselves happy with how Victoria 3's war system works out. Now, it does have some bugginess and jankiness at times. You won't see me pretending it doesn't. Fronts sometimes don't work right, and it's a janky system where knowing the location of your generals is a chore, and the combat width is not shown to you, yada yada. That just leaves one more piece of Victoria 3 to look at with regards to tactics, and that's its politics, which is an often underestimated aspect of the game in terms of how much fun can be had. Interest groups support different laws, and laws do things for you. You want to empower interest groups whose traits and laws follow the strategies that you want to use. And when it comes to manipulating your politics, you can spend the very valuable resource of authority on suppressing or bolstering political movements, or you can forego all that and get voting laws that help empower interest groups that you might want, but they could also empower the ones that you don't. You might bring in exiled agitators to support political movements that you care about, and then rile up those political movements to get them to contribute to law changes. You might exile troublesome interest group leaders, or use the negotiation button to make concessions to interest groups that you need the support of for law passes. My favorite tactic is, of course, demographically shift the nation to get the movements that you want. Do you want to kill off the peasant movement? Well, make more jobs and urbanize your nation with buildings so that there are fewer peasants. Do you want multiculturalism? Go conquer some Chinese states to suddenly give yourself a massive Han national movement. If you want to pass a law but fear revolution, pass a law that the opposing political movement wants, and then while they're satisfied with you, pass the other one. Better yet, if a political movement is threatening to revolt at an inopportune time, start passing some law they want to calm them down, then once you're ready to face them, or have otherwise found a way to stop their revolution, cancel the law and laugh at them. I find that the construction of my nation's laws is something for which I have no comparison to other GSGs. Victoria 3's politics are honestly really good, and I enjoy shaping my nation with shrewd compromises and opportunistic agitators quite a lot. Law changes tie heavily into the roleplay aspect of the game, especially considering that law changes cause events to happen, such as the one for becoming a republic where you execute your king and skip the whole law change thing to immediately become a republic. There is a tactic, albeit an annoying one, behind attempting to pass laws only to hope for good events that give you what you want, and sometimes I'm up for it, other times I'm not. It's essentially a way to inject some randomness into your game. With that, I want to talk about contrasts now, and I think the most obvious contrast in this case is absolutely EU5. In EU5, you click the parliament, change law for 50% parliament support, and then that's that. Nothing to worry about. That is a way less interesting, in just about every way imaginable, system than Victoria 3's. And on account of that, Victoria 3 stands pretty much entirely unrivaled in this particular aspect of tactical play. No other Paradox GSG even comes close to simulating domestic politics with quite so much interesting stuff going on than Victoria 3. When it comes to the challenge of this domestic politics system, by the way, it should be noted that the challenge is mostly based on random chances and praying that the sacrifices you make to get what you want actually work out. It's entirely possible that you will make some sacrifices or gamble on something going how you want it to, and then it won't. Now, I would rant about how I dislike a system which depends so strongly on randomness, but I think that for the occasional mechanic, it's okay. Were Victoria 3 to have too little randomness, it would fail to provide enough variety for each of its playthroughs. With that, I think I've exhausted what I'd like to say about Victoria 3's tactical gameplay, and I'd like to now move on to the simulation aspect of the game, which is something I don't have a ton to say about, but I care a lot about what's going to be said there. It is extremely important that I get across here that the simulation does not necessarily mean historical accuracy, but that historical accuracy can be part of it. I think GSGs need a sort of internal consistency, and for historical GSGs like Victoria 3, EU4, and well, all of them except I guess Stellaris, that internal consistency is heavily derived from history. This does not mean that any failure to simulate history is an inherent failure of the simulation. And in my 1000-hour review of Victoria 3, I talked about how the game has an obvious Marxist view on economics and the flow of history, and thus it has a consistent internal logic which does make sense in that view. I mentioned in that video that the game needs some kind of logic to base its economic interpretations on, and the Marxist way works well for the game if you ask me. For more information on that, watch that review, but getting back to the simulation, I think a GSG succeeds in its simulation when it's relatively easy to understand what the various numbers in the game are abstractions of. In CK3, prestige is an abstraction of your character's reputation, and their piety is an abstraction of their religious dedication, but that can be weird because a character that builds up a billion piety by executing people in the name of Odin can then convert to Christianity and still be considered highly pious. That's an example of an incongruence in the simulation, and in the case of CK3, it can feel a little bit weird, but like, it's whatever. The much more maligned EU4 Monarch Point system is an example of an abstraction that feels so nebulous that people have been complaining about it forever. That's a much more serious incongruity. Victoria 3, if you ask me, is insanely good at following a reasonable simulation because although not everything is simulated, the things that are come with a lot of information and readability. When I look at my pops and I can see their income, their discrimination status, their birth rate and mortality rate, their goods consumption and their political allegiances, I don't find myself scratching my head wondering, but what about this or that? That doesn't mean Victoria 3 simulates everything perfectly or historically accurately, but rather the logic it establishes, it then follows well. In Victoria 3, things tend to make sense, at least in my opinion. I also tend to have little issue with over-simulation or needlessly complex stuff. When something in Victoria 3 is complicated, it's complicated to the extent that it feels appropriate, but what's funny is that the game isn't really even that complex. Yeah, I know I'm the guy that makes several hour-long tutorials, but I mean, gotta stretch that video length for the mid-rolls, right? The reason tutorials go on long, but the individual mechanics are pretty simple, is because the strategy behind how to best make use of the mechanics needs explanation, but the individual mechanics are relatively simple. Referring back to the caveats, the simulation sometimes feels obscure because of poor tooltips. However, I will say, a lot of the time the most egregious tooltip fails are the things that people rarely look at, so it's not so big a deal. The most important screen to get right is the pop screen, which shows their info, and that screen is pretty damn solid. The tooltips work very well there, and again, everything feels fitting and sensible. When compared to other simulations, Victoria 3 provides the most well-abstracted information of any Paradox game that I can think of personally. The reason this matters is because it makes the world building of your playthrough much easier to imagine. Things like the economy are also well abstracted, with ownership, profits, and worker compositions easy to find and imagine. Only the wages, as discussed before, have a useless tooltip. Beyond the numbers and what they represent, I appreciate the dynamic between interest groups and political movements, which are abstractions of top-down political pressure and bottom-up political pressure. Interest groups derive power from the wealth of their supporters in less democratic systems or from votes in more democratic systems. Political movements derive their power from how radical their supporters are. And it's a common complaint that people have when they're like, I don't like when a political movement with just 10% of my population starts a civil war that takes half my country over. And yeah, okay, sometimes civil wars are kind of silly, but do you have any idea how much power an army of 10% of a nation can wield? I think sometimes the power of radicalism is easy to underestimate, and to me, it's not a disconnect when a small but highly motivated group tries to overthrow the government. The interest group traits represent to me something of the identity of the nation's political groups, but I do wish there was more to the interest group trait system. Perhaps the ability to change them around if certain requirements are fulfilled as a way to represent the evolving identity of the nation. That's a pretty small little nitpick though, which I'm trying to avoid for this video, so we'll move swiftly on. I want to add here that whether Victoria 3 is historically accurate or not, which is something I'm not qualified to speak on, the game establishes itself and then sticks to it nicely. That being said, in case you do want to better know about the historicity of Victoria 3, as I mentioned, check out Rosenkreutz's videos. He has some excellent stuff on the topic. I'd recommend that you check them out. For me, how well the game adheres to history is only lately important. So if the decentralized nations of Africa are a bit inaccurate, or like the nature of Canadian Confederation is inaccurate to reality, you're not going to see me complain much. It's just important to me that the broad strokes of history end up occurring like the Confederation of Canada at all, among other examples. In my rather uneducated opinion, Victoria 3 does a good enough job of simulating itself with enough roots in reality that doesn't feel like total chaos. In this respect, CK3 can have a lot of trouble, with there being basically no historical railroads whatsoever in that game, alongside its other simulational issues. But again, CK3 is still a very good game if you ask me, and succeeds in what it does well enough that those things can be overlooked. Anyway, I would do the compare and contrast method here, but to be quite frank, I think Victoria 3 is in a league of its own with regards to its simulation, as the other Paradox games just don't really even come close. While maybe EU5 is at least trying, but oh my goodness, the UI in that game is so terrible for finding information about your pops. Victoria 3's pop info screen is just so clean, it really can't compare. Rather than harp on this stuff, I think it'd be best to move on to the next core feature, which is going to be a short but funny one to go over, the line go up effect. In some Paradox games, there's a focus on modifier stacking, and in others, there's more focus on a graph that steadily or perhaps exponentially rises. In EU4, you modifier stack, but in Hoi 4, your stockpiles exponentially increase and you get better and better generals over time. There may be even more to Hoi 4, but again, I don't play it much. In Victoria 3, your entire goal is to see the lines of GDP, SOL, and literacy, perhaps, go up. That much is well known. But what else do you do in Victoria 3? You stack throughput on buildings, you stack profits, and you stack trade routes. Now, that leads naturally into asking what makes for a good line go up game, and I think it can be simply said that a good game in this regard is one where we do not just stack modifiers in large numbers, but that in so doing there is significant impact in the game. In EU4, when you get 140% discipline, you feel how insanely strong your army is. EU4 succeeds significantly in this sense. In Victoria 3, stacking up the right synergistic companies with prestige goods and state modifiers is very fun. Reaching over 120% throughput is a wonderful feeling, but beyond that, the economic impact of such efficient buildings is meaningful enough to carry a game. I'm reminded once more of my Haiti coffee game, where I stacked a huge throughput on my coffee plantations, which gave me the economic advantage to take an underdog nation and push them forward to eventually be the #1 great power. In this sense, the stacked up modifiers had impact, in that it boosted my economy enough to empower the nation, so it succeeds in our measure of line go up quality. Now I will say, with Victoria 3, you're not reaching any modifier stacking insanity like EU4. However, I'd argue that to some extent, the lack of ways to stack up more and more modifiers makes each one more meaningful. Remember, our measure of quality here is there needs to be a significant impact, and when your buildings are as much as even 50% more efficient than someone else's, or perhaps even 100% more efficient, it does have significant impact on how the GDP line grows, how the trade routes grow, and how even standard of living will grow, depending on the industry of course. There is something to be said as well for the style of play where you go on a conquest spree and stack up military modifiers with mobilization options and companies, which has a catharsis that is based on how frustrating warfare can feel. When you can find yourself often locked in stalemates with the AI on stagnant fronts, getting chemical weapons and destroying your enemies does feel extremely satisfying, and I felt that satisfaction in my Canada video when I invaded Europe with all the mobilization options on. Seeing the GDP spike from conquering England, France, Germany, and the other industrial hearts of Europe was a similarly good feeling. I'm going to add something here which might kind of be controversial, but I find that in Victoria 3, figuring out how to make standard of living go up can be difficult at times, and that can be frustrating sometimes because it feels like I'm being deprived of my line go up feeling. There's the other side of that coin though, which is that when you do make the line go up, it's all the more satisfying. In some ways, there's a contrast with EU4 here, where modifiers are as simple as spending monarch points on idea groups, but that's not quite fair because some EU4 modifiers come from missions which can be difficult to complete, so it's a wash. I find that when I get my standard of living up to around 20 in Victoria 3, I feel really proud of it, and when my GDP hits $1 billion, I feel like I earned it. Whereas in EU4, forming Prussia as Brandenburg with quality ideas for huge discipline does feel satisfying, yes, but it feels more vapid, less earned we might say. Instead, it might feel satisfying to do it as quickly as possible maybe, but that's of course a matter of opinion, but then again, so is the whole video. To give a stronger example of vapid modifier stacking, I think Crusader Kings 3 is a salient option. I know people love watching those playing tall videos, and I've even made one myself, albeit with some extra stuff to give it some spice. But let's be honest here, stacking development doesn't really matter much in CK3, and doing so just kind of gives you more and more gold which you can't even really spend. CK3 does have cathartic modifier stacking, like getting a bunch of men-at-arms stats by very intelligently choosing your buildings and cultural traditions, and I absolutely don't want to put down any of the other Paradox games. I'm just saying that Victoria 3 is very good at making its line go up action feel earned because it's not as easy as other games to actually get. I could be stretching here, but maybe there's a comparison with Hearts of Iron 4 multiplayer here. Stacking just the right modifiers to counter your opponent's build probably feels great, but there's obviously a very different sort of joy to be had from multiplayer. Bully 4 is more a game of builds and plans, a game of strategy we might say, than a game of modifier stacking. Speaking of which, I think I've said everything I want to say about the line go up core feature of Victoria 3, which is best summarized as, you have to earn your line go up feeling in Victoria 3, and when you do get it, it feels very impactful. In EU4, it's impactful but too easy to get. In CK3, it's not very impactful, but it can be fun to stack up modifiers anyway because of the convoluted ways of making it work. Let's move on now to a little bit about multiplayer, which is a sector where Victoria 3 takes what would otherwise be relatively lame, that is the diplomatic play system, and gives it some much needed life. Now look, I need to be clear here that I don't play very much Victoria 3 multiplayer, but I have played some, and Victoria 3 provides huge opportunities for both cooperative play and competitive play. In each of these chapters, I've laid out by what measure I judge each of the core features, and for multiplayer, I'm a little more flimsy on how good of a judgment metric this even is. To me, multiplayer is best judged by asking the question, if a player were here instead of an AI, how much more fun would I be having? And I say that's flimsy because the answer will depend on things like who is playing or the nature in which you play. It's quite possible that if you're playing Portugal and you replace Spain with a player that wants to conquer Portugal, you will suddenly be having less fun. It's equally possible then that by playing Portugal with a Spain player that wants to work together and specializing your own gameplay style to suit the others, you'd be having more fun. Thus, we're going to change how I judge this core feature instead of based on how many mechanics exist which, when in the hands of a player, are enhanced. Again, it's vague and I'm sorry for that, but this is a tough metric. I think every Paradox game is improved by multiplayer, assuming you're not playing with people you hate. But Victoria's economic system, especially when played in co-op, becomes a whole new game to some extent. In Victoria 3, you have limited company slots representing how many industries you can specialize your economy into. Well, if you can trust a fellow cooperative player to specialize their economy differently than yours and then intertwine your economies, you can actually spiral up your economies even more and use company monopoly mechanics and investment rights to make a sort of new game. A game where perhaps you roleplay and cooperate for a bit until some kind of issue gets in the way and then you have to now disentangle your economies. That doesn't necessarily mean you can't compete with each other either, with the diplomatic treaty system opening up massively in multiplayer. Where the AI will basically refuse to ever do anything meaningful like state or subject transfers, we could see a world where Portugal trades Angola and Mozambique to Spain for Cuba or something, at least in this hypothetical. I think Victoria 3 has a lot of mechanics that are significantly improved by the presence of a player, and it has more of these sorts of things than a game like EU4. In EU4, perhaps with players you can make use of condottieri better, and you can make unofficial deals so the other players will inevitably break with no consequences in the game itself. I've played just a little bit of EU4 multiplayer in my time, and let me tell you, if you haven't before, you need to be made aware of how toxic those communities can be. The amount of work larger communities put in to stop griefers and people who break deals over and over is crazy. Meanwhile, Generalist's classic 3v3v3 match setup rarely needed to deal with any such problems in Victoria 3. Maybe that's because it's a smaller community or something, I don't know, but I think it's more because you can actually make treaties in Victoria 3 which do bind you to certain behavior, and they can be broken, but with an actual in-game punishment for doing so. That being said, those 3v3v3s were actually played before diplomatic treaties came out, so people were making deals outside the game and then breaking them and causing some toxicity, but I digress. I think every multiplayer community will be a little toxic despite the nature of competitive gaming, but I genuinely think that Victoria 3 is extremely well suited to cooperative play via companies and trade. I do have to step back and say that it's possible I have a false interpretation of Victoria 3's multiplayer because I've only really participated in that 3v3v3 format as well as having commentated it, and otherwise haven't played much, nor have I played much multiplayer in any of other Paradox games. Let me know what you think of multiplayer in these games in general down in the comments for sure. I'm always curious about differences in thought that my community might have. Of course, everyone is wrong and I'm right, and any other interpretation can only be called alternate history. I don't know, is that a good transition into talking about alternate history as a core feature? Victoria 3 is a game which has a lot of alternate history possibility when you account for the fact that it's only 100 years of history, and that you have to moderate your expectations around that. Yes, Crusader Kings 3 has way more possibility for massive change because it covers up to 600 years of history. EU4 similarly covers like around 400 years of time. The obvious compare and contrasts here will of course be with EU4 and Holy 4 respectively, who handle alternate history very differently. But before we talk about that, we have to ask what makes for good alternate history gameplay. This is a tough one, but I propose that good alternate histories are ones which affect the place in which they're relevant to a strong extent, and that the game represents that effect through its mechanics. In Hoi 4, the choice to install the Kaiser in Germany changes the game massively because the focus tree they can then pursue is completely different than the fascist one. That's a solid way to do alternate histories, and Hoi 4 has mixed alternate history paths, with some nations not really having interesting alternatives and others having very deep paths to follow. It just depends on how much attention developers have given to those nations. Victoria 3 is contrast with Hoi 4 in this way, in that alternate history in Victoria 3 is more systems based. If Karl Marx gets exiled and you invite him to Canada to lead the trade unions and then he gets elected Prime Minister, as happened in my Canada-Brazil game, then the impact there is going to entirely be mechanical. It's not like you unlock the Karl Marx focus or something like that. Instead, you'll have a communist in power, and that means turning Canada into a council republic with cooperative ownership, or maybe it just means changing some tax laws. Victoria 3's alternate histories are less visible than Hoi 4 because of this. Imagine you play 50 years in Victoria 3, totally focused on your own nation, let's say it's Canada. Well, it could be that a nation like Prussia has gone through some kind of huge turmoil and upheaval. It could be that they had some civil wars which stopped them from unifying Germany, or the Kaiser has been overthrown, leading to a republic there. It's entirely possible to glance over at Europe and just see that Germany hasn't formed. I think that's the whole story. I guess the AI failed, end of alternate history. Now, the difference in governance for a nation when there's a monarchy or a republic isn't particularly huge. What matters more is the ideology of whoever's leading the nation, whether a monarchy or a republic or what. If the Kaiser gets overthrown, and then the Republic is led by a bunch of moderate industrialists, it's likely that not much will change. Maybe Prussia will change to laissez-faire, and we can use our imaginations to imagine this plutocratic Prussia maybe, but there aren't really any interesting changes to the mechanics on account of that. That's not because playing a Prussian Republic wouldn't be interesting, but rather because the AI doesn't really change its behavior much on account of stuff like that. Tying a little bit into the roleplay of the game, Victoria 3, when in the hands of a player, can see lots of crazy alternate histories that have huge impacts on the game when player-led, but otherwise sees little historical foibles, like Ireland going free from Britain or maybe a Russian republic here and there. I feel like I never see any AI corporate states, by the way, which is a shame. The problem of alternate history with regards to the AI in Victoria 3 is indeed exactly that, an AI issue. The AI just doesn't make much use of its curious historical situation to make new histories, but you as the player absolutely can. Mechanically, Victoria 3's alternate history potential is, I would say, pretty above average in the hands of a player, but below average in the hands of the AI. It certainly beats out EU4 with regards to the differences in governance, where a theocracy, republic, and monarchy are only really different insofar as what modifiers they stack, with the explicit exception of monarchies maybe making unions with each other for some fun alternate histories. Victoria 3 does also have journal entries, which are more Hoi 4-esque in how they work. Some journals provide interesting alternate histories, like the United States of Greater Austria letting Austria embrace a new identity of tolerance, or like Brazil, which can try to maintain Emperor Pedro's rule. There are also kind of lame journal entries for alternate history, like Canada's Confederation, where there's not really any path beyond just confederating or not confederating. There's no way for provinces to refuse to confederate or for a province to demand some kind of concession in return for joining. There's no way for the confederation to happen beyond having good relations with Britain and just peacefully doing it. I don't know if anyone knows, but historically in the 1800s, Canada, well, the Canadas at the time, had a lot of different rebellions and violent uprisings. It's not like Britain decided to confederate Canada for no reason. It was on account of rising tensions and administrative strain. History aside, most of Victoria 3's alternative history comes from your imagination, which means it doesn't do a good job of passing the criteria I've set out for it, and yet, it still blows the water out of some other games. I am quite happy to say that HOI4 has better alternate history systems, thanks to its focus trees. EU4 has mission trees, and some of those have alternate histories in them, sure, but ultimately, it's just modifiers, man. In Victoria 3, the difference between a republic and a monarchy is not just modifiers, although it does have some modifiers, but it's also how governments are formed and how legitimacy is calculated. It's who gets to lead the nation and what ideologies influence the nation's laws. Those laws determine how wealth is distributed, how migration works, how your taxes function, and what cultures will be discriminated against. Beyond that, we might look at the alternate history of how Africa is carved up, or the influence power blocks might have, and Victoria 3 is much stronger in all these aspects. The British Empire, as a power block, could lose control of India, or gain control of Indochina. We might see a collapsed China, or a unified Qing. We might see an American empire that controls all of South America by economic influence rather than conquest. We could see a strong French empire that takes its claims up to the Rhine River, and perhaps even an Italy that remains disunited and instead split into spheres of influence under Austria, France, and Britain. The international outcomes of the game are much better in Victoria 3, and they feel reasonable a lot of the time because of Victoria 3's short time frame. In CK3, the game is so long and so what I'd call rubbery that absolutely insane, nonsensical things can happen, while at the same time, because how CK3's mechanics work, there can be little actual mechanical impact from those things happening. If an Andalusian Muslim dominates all of Spain in CK3, he's still going to build all the same farms and fields and the same barracks buildings. He's still going to make a dynasty which might convert the people to his faith and culture, or maybe won't, depending on what kind of Islam he's following. The biggest impact these foreign conquests can have are hybrid cultures, but that affects things like what men-at-arms they'll use, and maybe like what terrain they get development bonuses in. Not exactly a huge impact if you ask me. It has a lot of roleplay impact, but not a lot of gameplay impact. EU4 I think walks a more reasonable line with regards to things following a somewhat reasonable history, but still leaves space for alternative outcomes with some impact. Anyway, Victoria 3 I think succeeds in creating these alternate histories because the choice around things like your economic model significantly impacts mechanical outcomes like your standard of living, and the choice to pursue an ethno-state or a multicultural liberal empire see demographic shifts and changes to wages that will also affect the economy and power of the game's nations. One thing I really appreciate about Victoria 3 as well is how a lot of its railroading attempts, like the Springtime of the Peoples, are far from railroads. You know what that journal does? It just increases the radicalism of your nation. It's not a railroad, it's a push on all of Europe's monarchies, telling them that for the next 3 years, your people will be a lot harder to please and a lot more demanding. Sometimes this results in the British Republic, sometimes it results in the total dissolution of Austria, and other times, their revolutions entirely fail. But it's not because of some deterministic railroad. It's because sometimes that push of radicalism is enough to send a nation off the cliff, and other times it's not. Depends on how the nation has been running for the first decade or so of the game. Does it succeed more than HOI4? No, but I do think it beats out EU4 slightly and rises far above CK3 in that sense. HOI4 has the advantage of essentially getting curated alternate history paths, which has the downside of somewhat stifling other kinds of creativity, but Victoria 3, if anything, impresses me more because it manages to have meaningful alternate histories without needing such strong railroading for something like a focus tree or a mission tree. I will defend CK3 a little bit here and say that CK3's roleplay focus can make these alternate histories more interesting because although mechanically they're lacking, the story around which they can happen can be very entertaining. With that, we have just one more core feature to discuss, and that's identity, which can perhaps also be called flavor. Flavour. The bane of Victoria 3, some might say. Every nation plays the same, it's just a building queue simulator. I'm sure you've heard this before, and it did hold significant water back in the 1.0 days. I remind you again, Victoria 3 has changed significantly. I'm not talking about journal entries, the presence of which is nice for adding identity to nations, but rather I'm talking once again about companies. Look, it's quite simple, guys. Companies in Victoria 3 are identity. More than journals, more than intergroup traits, more than historical characters, the companies determine your nation's flavor and identity. Flavour in Victoria 3 is thus accessible to pretty much anyone, as you can in theory conquer the necessary states to make whatever companies that you want, with only a handful of exceptions, like many of Japan's companies that require you to be Japan to use. How do you identify quality flavor content? It's quite simple. Does the flavor content make playing a particular nation feel meaningfully different from playing another nation? The answer here for Victoria 3 is a lukewarm yes. I'm harping on companies which to me are the best way to make your economy feel unique to your nation, especially through unique prestige goods and their prosperity bonuses, but we shouldn't totally discount the role of journals and the simple fact of their starting positions. Playing a nation like Persia, which has serfdom and traditionalism laws alongside no modernization movement to help fix that, is vastly different than playing the Ottoman Empire, which also has serfdom but which has a modernization movement at the start of the game to help it push towards, well, modernization. Persia's unique companies also inform some of its play patterns. You're much more likely to pursue some kind of textile industry when considering how many different textile companies Persia has access to, in combination with its large collection of both silk and dyes, and companies for those goods too. Victoria 3's flavor compares well to EU5 or CK3, I'd say, more so than EU4 or HOI4. The flavor is in what strategies you pursue or what stories you pursue rather than mission trees or focus trees. Journals function a lot more like EU5's situations in that they are shepherds towards certain outcomes rather than paths which are followed strictly. Flavor has also somewhat come in the form of law variants and amendments, which are still a young mechanic, but they serve to make a nation like Austria have significant flavor. The manorialism law variant gives Austria a good reason to want to stay sort of backwards because the bonus construction efficiency from it does streamline your economy, but of course you'll be locking something like half of your population into being peasants. Nonetheless, if you stick with your absolutist backwards government, you can get the Autocracy in the Age of Liberty journal, which will buff up your autocracy law to be more powerful. No other nation than Austria can really play this way with the focus on autocratic play. Most nations sort of just want to liberalize. Not all flavors in the form of journals are companies though. I mentioned starting positions with Persia as an example, but one salient example of a sort of mix of these things is America and its slavery debate. Slavery is not just a law, nor just a journal, but it actually changes how you plan your economy. Because the violent treatment production method that slavery provides you is kind of insanely strong for making plantations ridiculously good, that will affect your company choices and your play patterns. This gives America a strong sense of identity, but beyond that, it's not like that's all you get. You can also fight the Civil War, and during Reconstruction, decide if you want to take on Afro-American as a primary culture. If you do so, it's not like you just click a button and now you accept Afro-Americans. You have to actually get the cultural exclusion law so that they are first tolerated, then embraced. This will also change how you play, because now you can take on African heritage migrants much more easily, and you can incorporate African heritage states more easily too. This is all flavor, and Victoria runs the gamut on providing journal flavor, company flavor, historical events, and character flavor, and even mechanical flavor via its different starting positions. I think Victoria 3 gets unfairly maligned for its flavor because it's harder to spot. So much of Victoria 3 suffers with this issue of being difficult to really see. It's obvious what flavor an EU4 nation gets because you just look at their ideas and look at their mission tree. It's obvious what flavor a CK3 character gets by looking at their cultural traditions, their government type, and their decisions, but I'm telling you, Victoria 3 is full of flavor. It's just rooted in the systems. Victoria 3 is a deeply systemic game, and even its journals often flourish in their dedication to providing new mechanical and systemic outcomes, like Austria's journal, which rewards you with new ways to play. The reward for becoming the United States of Greater Austria is not just a modifier, although I think it does come with one, I forget. It's that you get access to a ton of primary cultures. Even little things like the obsessions and taboos on cultures and faiths can be a kind of flavor, but that's sort of stretching it because honestly, their impact isn't so strong that it'll likely steer your economy. With that, I think Victoria 3's flavor provides a strong sense of identity to each nation, with of course some overlap between some countries. Like, yes, Argentina and Chile play kinda similarly. Yes, Upper Canada and Lower Canada play about the same. But in terms of the difference between playing the United States and Austria, it's massive in terms of your companies, journals, economic conditions, political aspirations, and so much more. I'll go out on a limb and even say that I think Victoria 3's flavor beats out EU4 and HOI4. I have to say, I prefer these mechanical flavor points than railroaded missions and focuses. Sorry. I'd say it beats out EU5, but to be honest, I haven't played much EU5 lately, and I need to play it more to judge its flavor better. The way EU5 does its dynamic historical event system is kind of weird, and maybe it can provide good flavor, but that system is so opaque and arcane that I kinda hate it. Anyway, that's Victoria 3's flavor. I want to sort of wrap things up here now and talk holistically about how Victoria 3 earns the title of Best Paradox Game. I had said in the intro to this video that while Victoria 3 might fall behind other games in particular aspects such as its roleplay, which obviously falls behind CK3, it ends up averaging out in all of its aspects to be a better total game than any other Paradox game. I think this holds true, despite the caveats that I presented. Yes, the warfare has problems, albeit different ones than what people keep repeating with their warfare bad aphorisms. Yes, some of the tooltips are really bad. I put forward the bold response of, so what? Are you willing to overlook all this quality content and gameplay because you can't micro the little soldiers? Are you such a Victoria 3 hater because you saw a game with a poor release and decided the game is bad now? You know what other games had bad releases? Let's see, EU5? Oh yeah, that legend of a game which has had an abysmal release rife with non-functional systems and bugs. Where's all the EU5 hate gonna be in 3 years when the game probably gets turned around to something playable? I should hope the hate will die when that game is fixed, which is a charity afforded to every Paradox game that has a broken release, which is all of them. How about CK3? It came out perhaps one of the most bare-bones Paradox games, but now, many years later, is a beloved mix of roleplay and strategy which rightfully earns its positive reviews. I never played Victoria 2, but from what I've heard, that game too came out as a mess and was fixed up with its DLCs. I won't expand on that because it's only stuff I've heard, so I can't point to anything particular there, but yeah, you Victoria 2 will hate Victoria 3, but your game also sucked on release. I was not part of the crowd that said Victoria 3 was good on release. In fact, I was deeply critical of the game, finding it boring, repetitive, and promptly dropping it to go back to being CK3 content after growing tired of it. Nonetheless, I kept coming back to Victoria 3 with each DLC. I was checking in, seeing what my response would be to the classic "is Vic 3 good yet?" question. Well, I'd say the moment Victoria 3 really did turn good was probably around Spheres of Influence. It turned great with the release of Charters of Commerce, and the following flavor packs like National Awakening and Iberian Twilight, which helped give some identity to popular nations. Those DLCs tipped it over onto the top of the pack. I feel hopeful that there will be more solid flavor content which will enhance the game, and I'm crossing my fingers for a Diplomatic Play rework because, to be quite frank with you, if Diplomatic Plays can get reworked to something good, Victoria 3 will more or less have addressed all of its major flaws. There's still a tooltip issue, and time will tell if how wages even work will remain the same or not, so jury's out on that one. I think in its current state, Victoria 3 takes the mantle of best Paradox game, but time will tell how EU5 pans out. I like EU5, and I think it's a great game, but look yourself in the mirror, and then look at the current state of that game, and see if you have the balls to tell yourself that that game is better than Victoria 3 right now. HRE, non-functional. Japan, non-functional. AI, insane. Flavor, random opaque events. The economy, same every game. No specialization. This is not an EU5 hate video. It's a Victoria 3 love video. I think in terms of strategy, Victoria 3 has you making choices that will determine not just your success in achieving goals like top GDP or top literacy and so on, but that will determine the very nature of your society and the rest of the map in some cases. No other Paradox game's strategic choices carry so much of a rippling effect with your choices about what land to conquer, what companies to make, and what nations to oppose or befriend, having wide-reaching consequences quite like Victoria 3. In EU4, going from allies to rivals with France just means you have different war targets. In Victoria 3, the loss of a critical trade partner might mean you'll have to reorient your economy to suit the lost trades, and you might have to fight different war targets. I don't think any other Paradox game currently even comes close to Victoria 3 in that aspect. Roleplay-wise, the crown absolutely goes to CK3, but Victoria 3 manages to snag a second place spot thanks to its random events which managed to give it some character, but it lacks a lot of player-driven narrative. Nonetheless, the way that choices around ideology, governance, and politics in the game impact so many facets of the game leads to an easy sense of story, which is lacking in games like EU4, EU5, or HOI4, where the impact of most events is just numbers being changed around. With regards to challenging tactical gameplay, Victoria 3's AI puts up a high bar and asks you to jump if you want to reach it. Depending on the goals that you set for yourself, you can access a wide plethora of different ways to play the game, whether it be outcompeting others on the world market, conquering valuable land, or bringing in migrants with high standards of living, among other tactics. Some tactics are better than others, but most of them are fun to engage with, and given you set the bar of what end goal you want, all tactics are viable unless you're aiming for some lofty goal. It's unlikely you can ever become #1 GDP in the world on a purely mercantilist plantation economy, but that tactic is still fun if your goal is just to make a really rich upper class or something. This all being said, HOI4 probably still takes the crown in this aspect with how many different army compositions and tech paths there are to follow. HOI4's micro alone gives a significant tactical edge. I'd still put Victoria 3 at the second place spot with how its economic tactics provide a challenge though. Victoria 3's simulation is completely untouchable on the other hand. The information on POPs itself beats out EU5, which is the only game even approaching Victoria 3's level of simulation, but then we also have detailed domestic politics, interest groups with ideologies and leaders that change over time, and all of this is rooted in real mechanics. The numbers that your POPs display in their stat screens actually mean something, and your choices with regards to that stuff actually matter. As a satisfying sort of line go up game, Victoria 3 is all about graphs. The best part is that it's not like the lines just go up no matter what you do. You earn your line growth in Victoria 3 with impactful reasons for pursuing things like standard of living. In CK3, you can acquire nearly infinite gold. And for what? So it can sit there and do nothing? You can get 100 development in a county, but why? For more gold that you don't need or more levies that you won't use because your men-at-arms are more important? EU4 has modifier stacking, and that is satisfying, but obtaining it is as simple as clicking a button. Want some discipline? Take quality ideas, whatever. In Victoria 3, if you want better standard of living, you're going to have to build a consumer economy, which is a lot more engaging than clicking an idea group. Thus, Victoria 3 takes the crown on this core feature too. But I really do believe that Victoria 3's features are enhanced the most by multiplayer. Treaties, diplomatic plays, monopolies, and investment agreements, these features are greatly enhanced by having other players in ways that I believe are lacking in other Paradox games. My lack of experience in multiplayer across the board though means I'm not willing to put my weight behind calling Victoria 3 the best multiplayer experience, so instead I will plead no contest in this one, citing insufficient evidence for or against the game. When it comes to the alternate histories available in Victoria 3, well, the AI doesn't often make use of the situations provided to them by the game's mechanics, but the fact that so much of Victoria 3's alternate historical outcomes are mechanically driven and not railroaded is something to be praised. Nonetheless, I do think that Holy 4's curated alternate history outcomes win out here, despite the fact that I generally prefer system-based approaches. Finally, there's the identity and flavor features, which Victoria 3 knocks out of the park by providing reasons why a nation has unique gameplay beyond what modifiers they stack. In EU4, your flavor is just what numbers you're good at, but in Victoria 3, the very nature of how you play is determined by your nation's starting position, available companies, and journals. I can't think of another Paradox game where the identity of a nation is represented so starkly, but nothing more than their mechanics. Sure, in EU4, step hordes play differently than monarchies, but in Victoria 3, every great power plays differently than each other. We only see truly overlapping gameplay in less played nations like the Canadas or the Boer states, where yes, gameplay will indeed be very similar. By now I'm sure I'm beating a dead horse, so let me finish things up here by passing the question off to you. If Victoria 3 isn't the best Paradox game currently, then which one is, and why? It's always acceptable to say something like, I prefer the time period covered in Hearts of Iron 4 or something like that, in the sense that you might have some kind of personal bias or preference for one game over another on account of the history that it covers. That's totally valid. But when putting aside such biases, Victoria 3 really does end up on top if you ask me. It might also be that you particularly value just one core feature over another. This is why CK3 can be such a farce of a strategy game but still be hugely popular. Its roleplay elements are so good and so worthwhile to pursue that it ends up being fun and worth playing despite its other failings. That too is valid, but it has to be recognized as a failing of the game to be the best Paradox Grand Strategy game. Not your favorite, but the best. If you tried to make the argument that CK3 was the best Paradox Grand Strategy game, you have to contend with the fact that a pretty massive part of CK3's appeal carries little to no value for a pretty massive part of the community that plays it. Victoria 3 carries enough appeal to all the aspects of Grand Strategy gaming that it can rightfully be crowned the best Paradox Grand Strategy game. If you made it to the end of the video, thanks so much for spending your time listening to me rant. I made this video because I've gotten tired of hearing the same old ragged complaints about Victoria 3 which aren't even valid anymore, and I want Victoria 3 to receive the praise which it rightfully deserves in the face of its quality DLCs and patches. Especially in the light of EU5's botched release, does Victoria 3 truly shine? And again, I like to emphasize that I do like EU5, but that game is going to need a few years before it can maybe dethrone Victoria 3. Time will tell. Anyway, that's all for now. I hope you found this video useful and entertaining. Thank you for your time.